The world is coming to an end. We should all be afraid. People have used this mantra over and over again throughout history to get people to do things. We've seen it over the last 18 months. Doom and gloom. We were going to have 150,000 deaths from COVID in Australia. I'm not sure how many we've had, but we've not had anywhere near that number. But it got people to do something. The world's going to fall apart because of climate change. We all have to suddenly hurry up and do something. But this is not a modern phenomenon. You can go back right throughout history and people have claimed the world is going to end, disaster is going to happen, we all have to change what we're doing because disasters are about to happen. You go back into ancient times, even in the Old Testament, they're thinking, when is the world, what's going to happen at the end of the world? Is God's going to separate people, the good from the bad? This is what we were sort of hearing about in the first reading, the prophet Daniel. You have the book of Apocalypse. It's the last book of the Bible, which talks a bit about the end times. And some people read that and they become afraid. They think, what's it all going to look like? We see this in contemporary literature. You see it sometimes in sci-fi movies. The world is going to suddenly fall apart. There was a French prophet and astrologer, Nostradamus, who said in the 16th century, he foretold that the world would end when Easter fell on April 25th. Well, Easter fell on April 25th in 1666, in 1734, in 1886 and in 1943. The next time that that Easter will fall on April 25th is 2038. So we'll see what happens. In 1379, St. Vincent Ferrier, who was a Spanish Dominican, he based his prediction on the number of verses in the book of Psalms, and he predicted that the end of the world would happen in the year 3936 AD. So it's a long way off according to Vincent Ferrier. When's the end of the world going to happen? When's disaster going to happen? Scientists, people sometimes of faith, have claimed disasters are going to happen at different times. The Jehovah's Witnesses frightened gullible followers 4 times during the last 100 years with their end of the world predictions in 1918, 1974, and then in the year 2000. There was a group of people in the United States who there was a mass suicide by a group called Heaven's Gate in 1997. 38 people thought the end of the world was going to happen. They had been whipped up by a pastor in the United States and they all thought they were going to be taken by aliens, and so they all decided to commit suicide together. Predictions of when the end of the world is going to happen are very tempting. And over the last 18 months, I've heard a number of people say to me, and they think we're in the end times. COVID was happening, you had other things that were happening around the world, we had bushfires, we had economic collapses, you had mice plagues happening. They said this is a bit like Egypt with the time of the pharaohs. The world is coming to an end. And it's tempting to think this way. But this is not the way of the Christian. This is not the way of Jesus Christ. What our gospel is reminding us tonight is that nobody knows when the end of the world is going to happen. And if someone says it's going to happen tomorrow or in 10 years' time or 1,000 years' time, I don't think we should really listen to them. If someone thinks the world is going to fall apart, it's a nice thought, and perhaps we might want to do something, but perhaps it gives more fear than it does joy. As Christians, we are people of hope. We aren't people of doom and gloom. We are people of joy. And that's what we're called to spread. Even in the midst of pandemics, in the midst of wars, in the midst of destruction, we're called to be faithful, not because there is a war happening or there's a pandemic happening. We're not just called to be charitable to our neighbour when there's COVID happening. We're called to be charitable every single day. That's the commitment of God. And that's what we choose to do. We choose to be positive. We choose to be hopeful. We choose to be joyful. And when we're doing that today, and we do that tomorrow, we do that the next day, if the end of the world happens in a few days' time, Well, we're ready for it because we're living God's kingdom right now, not because someone's whipped us into this hysteria and fear. And there's been a lot of that happening. And perhaps it's been tempting for some of us, and even for me at times, to think the world, things are really falling apart. But we're faithful today. And when we come to Mass, we make a commitment to say, we're people of hope, we're people of joy. And we're going to live that now, we're going to live it tomorrow, and we're going to spread that with each other and our world this week. And I think that's one of the great challenges of where we're at right now. There is still a little bit of a sense of fear that's happening in our community. The people have been whipped up by everything that's happened, but we're called to live hope and joy every day. Even in the midst of suffering, in the midst of difficulties, let's be people of hope. Because we know that our God is not one of vengeance. Our God responds to the goodness that's there in our hearts. He's one of mercy, he's one of love, and he sees that in us. Let's live that out. Let's be people who commit to living the way of hope. Hope brings joy. Hope brings a smile. Hope lifts a person up when they're afraid. And that's what Jesus does over and over again. He lifts people up. Even on his way to the cross, Jesus is not caring about himself. He's lifting up others. He's there concerned for the women of Jerusalem who are there weeping, fearful, distraught. He lifts them up. He gives them hope, even though he was in the midst of great suffering. That's what we're called to do as well. This weekend is the last weekend of ordinary time. Next week will be the celebration of Christ the King. Next week, for the celebration of Christ the King, we will be back in the church. After several weeks, or 5 weeks now maybe, doing masses outdoors, or even here in the hall, we'll be back in the church. You might want to, if you'd like, after Mass, you could probably stop over and have a look inside. It's getting very close to being ready. It wasn't quite ready for today. They're still cleaning for us to be able to come back in, but we'll be able to be definitely back inside into our church for next week. I encourage you this week to spread hope and to encourage others to experience hope and to come back to experiencing our community, to experiencing the life of the Christian like we do, to pray, to reflect on our morals. Who do we live? We live the way of love. And how are we living that out? We live that out in charity. That's what we commit to as Christians. Pope Francis has proclaimed this Sunday as the Sunday of the poor. So who is poor in our world at this time? There are many who don't have food, who don't have access to the vaccines, who don't have access to water, who don't have access to clean air. There is lots of poverty. But we see poverty even in our own community here. Poverty of spirit, poverty with mental health. And part of that is our responsibility to lift people up. Let's be people of hope this week. Not doom and gloom, not of darkness, not of hysteria, but of peace and hope. This is the way of the Christian. This is the way of Jesus Christ. We're called to be watchful, to pray constantly, so that we may be worthy to stand before the Son of Man. That was what our gospel acclamation said today. Let's commit to that every day. Not because the world is coming to an end, because we don't know when that'll happen, but because that's what God has asked us to do. He loves us, we love our God, and so we respond with hope, with prayer, and with charity.